Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of your Women in Gender Studies course. I'm your professor, Dr. Maldonado. Let's get started. This week, we'll be examining feminisms, theories, and practices. Now, we covered feminism in Introduction of Feminism and Women's Activism within the US last week. However, we're going to have a little refresher here. There are three waves of feminism. What were the goals of each? What were the accomplishments of each? Let's go through each. So the first wave, the goal and accomplishment was citizenship. The second wave, the goal and accomplishment was educational and workplace equality. And the third wave was the rejection of feminist labeling. True or false? Since feminism as a whole champions for institutional equity and equality, there's only one type of feminism. Is that true or is that false? False. There are multiple types of feminisms. Remember, because different types of feminisms cater to different groups, there are different strategies and investments due to those different demographics, where all of them still have the same goal of achieving institutional equity and equality. Now, this refresher is pertinent to our lesson for this week because we'll be situating different feminist perspectives within the context of sex work, specifically male sex work. So, before we get into it, what is sex work? Sex work is the allocation of sexual services to others in exchange for monetary or material goods. Many people often confuse sex work with selling oneself. However, you do not sell your entire existence. You do not sell your body to another person when you are engaged in consensual sex work. In sex work, you are merely selling sexual services to another person. Just like when you go to the nail salon to get your nails done, you're not buying a human or buying another human's hands in order to take them home with you to do your nails forever. No, they are selling a service to you in exchange for monetary or material goods. They're selling their skill in doing your nails. After they finish your nails and you pay, you leave the establishment. You don't take that person or their hands with you. So similar with sex work, they are selling sexual services. That customer pays, and then they part their own ways. Now, what is male sex work? Male sex work is men selling of sexual services to other men in exchange for monetary or material goods. So stereotypically, most people think of sex work as women as the contractor of sex and men as the customer of sex. However, for this presentation, we'll be examining men as the sex contractor and also men as the sex work customer, as this scenario is severely understudied. So here's why we use sex work instead of prostitution and sex workers instead of prostitutes. Why do you think prostitute and prostitution may be more problematic than sex work and sex workers? Because there's an historical stigma with the word prostitute. There's often negative connotations and also stigmatizing the profession. Sex work is the oldest trade, the oldest profession in the book. People have been selling sex and sexual services since the beginning of time in order for money, for shelter, for food, for water, for basic necessities, for love, etc. So we also use sex work and sex workers to reframe the contractors of sex as humans rather than as objects. Again, you don't buy people. That's trafficking, and trafficking is not consensual. However, in sex work, one can buy sexual services. And if it's both consensual on both ends, then it's a consensual exchange. So, what's the purpose of this? Sex work conceptualizes sex work as a legitimate occupation and sex workers as human beings and not objects. So, are male sex workers heterogeneous or homogeneous? In other words, are male sex workers just one type or exemplified in one way? Or are there different types of sex workers? Are they exemplified in different ways? Sex workers are heterogeneous in general. Again, specifically, we'll be talking about male sex workers. There are different types of sex workers. However, most male sex workers are predominantly white men. So here's the male sex work hierarchy going from top to bottom. The top represents the most lucrative and protected of the type of sex worker, and the bottom represents the least lucrative and least protected type of sex worker. So at the top, you have the independent internet star. And I have this in parentheses because this bracket is not necessarily represented as well in the more antiquated literature as much as kept boy, call boy slash escort, bar worker, and street worker. With the onslaught of the internet, people have used the internet to sell sexual services. So the independent internet star is still relatively new with the onset of the World Wide Web. So next you have kept boy. You have call boy, escort. You have the bar worker, and then you have the street worker. And we're going to go through each of these. So again, the internet star is the highest level, and the street worker is the lowest level when it comes to sex work. So the independent internet star is this content creator. They sell sexual services without necessarily coming into physical contact with their customers. So they may sell their sexual services via social media, any type of platform that you can think of, such as Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, etc. And also on OnlyFans, which is a relatively new platform where people, again, create content on and sell videos and live streaming. Now, the independent internet star is fluid in terms of sexual identity. They can identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, etc. They're not necessarily represented by one particular sexuality. Now, with selling sexual services via the internet where you have no physical contact with customers, this exerts more freedom on the contractor side of selling sex work. Therefore, there's no immediate physical risks. You can be anywhere in the world and therefore have customers anywhere in the world if you are connected to the internet and selling your sexual services. Sometimes independent internet stars, they get their start on their own official websites that cater specifically to them, or they get their start on another pornographic website where they build up a following and then they may create their own website where they can take in all of the fees and payments that they charge customers instead of splitting fees and payments with their predominant hosting website. So the kept boy, now, this is what happens with the kept boy. Kept boys are usually younger men between 18 and probably middle 20s, probably middle to late 20s, where they have an older male suitor who pays for them, who pays for their lifestyle. So the kept boy, if they're in college, they may have their tuition paid, their room and board paid, all of their expenses, all of their expenses paid, or they may live with this older male gentleman. Now, this older male suitor, they are typically wealthy, or let's keep it simple. They're typically wealthy. Okay. Now, the older men, they may be older. It's definitely older in age, probably 50s, 60s, 70s or older. And they're lonely, these older men. So they pay for the company of younger men for sexual satisfaction or simply emotional support or company. Or the kept boy may live with that older man and they're kept. They don't have to work. They may be enrolled in school, but they usually don't have to work. They are paid for. Now, the kept boys, they're usually a gay identification. They identify as gay and are typically middle and upper class. Remember, we have probably talked about social economic class, how that can encapsulate both income and also occupation and also education and also the prestige of their occupation and education. Okay, so it will make sense for kept boys to be predominantly middle and upper class, especially since they'll be likely to be in similar circles or at least overlapping circles with wealthier men. Where they'll be able to meet them and then be solicited in order to be taken care of by older men. So, kept boys usually become kept boys voluntarily for extra income, or this may be their sole source of income, with depending on older, wealthier gentlemen. And they engage in the sex work for fun and sexual pleasure rather than out of necessity. Now, next on the tier, we have the call boy and escort. Now, the call boy slash escort, they may work for a massage parlor, or they may put their services in coded language in an online advertisement or newspaper ad, etc., where someone will email them or call their phone number in order to request sexual services. And of course, in a coded way, because selling sex work is selling sexual service, excuse me, selling sexual services is still considered illegal in most of the US outside of Nevada. So, cowboys escorts, they're typically identify as gay as well as the cat boys, and they typically come from middle and upper classes. Now, they engage in this type of sex work voluntarily and for extra income, and also for fun and sexual pleasure. It's not necessarily out of necessity, even though we're getting there with the financial necessity. Okay, now let's go further into these massage parlors. So there may be nail salons or massage parlors that are masqueraded as such. However, if a customer asks for a particular service or a happy ending, then that's when the exchange for a full body massage will go into something sexual, right? So, massage parlors are usually disguises for houses that can literally house or act as an agency for escort services. And also, sexual services are not only limited to call boys and escorts, but also accompanying folks out on an evening or a fancy dinner, right? With typically older, wealthier gentlemen, but they don't necessarily have to be older or wealthier like the kept boy, but the customers may be of various socioeconomic classes that are middle class and up, not necessarily working or lower class. Because again, if you're working or lower class, you would need to focus more on securing your shelter, food, and water and affording basic necessities than allocating money to sex. So usually the customers of call boys and escorts are middle class and up. Now you have the bar worker. Now, bar sex workers, they literally may work in a bar, and there are different levels of protection here, where you may have the bouncer who has the authority to check out customers and make sure they're not the sting or the SWAT or police or anyone else, right? And then you have other bartenders who may also check out the potential customers as well to check for any signs of being of the authority, right? So the bar sex workers, they may usually work at a bar or as wait staff, right? Where there may be some coded language or a customer may solicit this gentleman for sexual services. Now, bar sex workers, they're usually heterosexual or can be gay in identification as well. Now, they engage in this type of sex work out of delinquency and out of means for survival, especially when it comes to both of these potential sexual demographics, whether they may identify as straight or gay, right? So, yes, let's continue on. And then the lowest of the sex workers is the street sex worker. Now, according to the literature, most of these sex workers are heterosexual in identification and they engage in sex work because that's their sole source of income, especially when it comes to being young boys and young men, right? Young as in adolescence up into older adulthood, young adulthood, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, etc., right? And again, they engage in this type of sex work out of delinquency, means of survival, because if you do not have any job, if you do not have any skills, then what do you have in order to make money? Your body. So, folks who are on the fringes of society may engage in sex work in order to make money. Okay. This is not out of fun. This is not out of boredom. This is not for extra income. This is a person's sole source of income. They may not even have food, ready access to food, water, and shelter. So, street sex workers, they may also engage in sex work not only for money, but for drugs, also for a temporary place to stay, and also for food and water. Now, what are some aspects of sex work that can be considered pros and cons? How may these pros and cons contribute to the order of this established hierarchy? So, as one goes up this hierarchical ladder, it usually correlates with an increase in the following: income and perceptions of physical safety. Because you have to think about this, okay? If you are working the street, then you are exposed. There is no one checking for you. There is no one acting as your bodyguard. You are out on the street exposed, which makes you subject to physical violence, which makes you subject to sexual violence, which makes you subject to being arrested, etc. However, if you're in a bar, you're literally inside of an establishment with cameras, also a bouncer that's manning the bar, in bar's entrance, also the manager of the bar, also the other bartenders, and also the perception of physical safety in numbers, right, from customers. Now, the callboy escort, they are also in an establishment or can be, or you may have a manager or a madam that is manning the phones where customers may call in to request sexual services. That's another layer of protection where the manager can screen customers. Okay. And there's a buffer in between the customer and also the sex worker where you have the phone. A customer literally has to come up to an establishment as they would in a bar, okay, and go through these means of being registered and purchasing the sexual service. Whereas on the street, you're completely exposed. You have none of these protections. Now, the kept boy, okay, also increase in income as well with the call boy and the escort and the bar worker, and also perceptions of physical safety because with the being kept, you are only dealing with one individual, more than likely. Now, someone can be kept across multiple individuals, right? Depends on how they play this strategy. But if you are only under one individual with being kept, that's physical safety. You trust them. You're living in their house or they're paying for your housing expenses. And that also correlates with higher income. Then the highest income and perceptions of physical safety is when you don't have to engage in any contact with customers at all because you're separated through the internet, the World Wide Web, and you can control how much content you make and how much you charge with your content, and that correlates with an increase in income. Now let's go to some more components that increase as you go up this hierarchical ladder: condom usage, and comfortability with profession. Let's start with comfortability with profession. At the street level, you're not comfortable. You more than likely you're homeless. More than likely you are struggling with securing basic necessities like food, water, shelter, clothing. All right. And so you may be engaging with this sex work on the street level out of necessity and because you have to in order to survive. And there's little comfortability with the profession because more often than not, street sex workers are heterosexual in identification when it comes to the men who are street sex workers. And they have to negotiate their sexual behavior in order to achieve basic needs. However, though, as you go up, okay, the bar, the call boy, the cat boy, and the independent film star, that comfortability increases. And why do you think so? Because as we mentioned earlier, starting here with the street, more often than not, you go from heterosexual identification to potentially being bisexual, to potentially being gay, to being gay and even more gay. Okay. Very, very good. Or gay for pay. When it comes to the independent internet star, gay for pay is when you have a heterosexual man who engages in homoeroticism in order for money, homoerotic visuals, or even homoerotic acts with other men for money. All right. So condom usage. Condom usage not necessarily guaranteed at the street level, okay? Because a customer can refuse to wear a condom, or the customer may offer more money in order to have condom-less sex or condom-free sex. And if a person is desperate for food, water, shelter, clothing, they may acquiesce to not wearing condoms in order to get more drugs or more money, etc., or whatever that they're exchanging for their sexual service. So, condom usage also tricky at the bar level as well. Okay, because a customer can offer more money. Any of these levels, the customer can offer more money. Usually, customers prefer to have condomless sex so they can feel, quote, the real thing, unquote, right? But also, as you ascend up this hierarchical ladder, the sex worker has more control over whether or not they want to decide to use condoms or not. Okay. So condom usage is also seen as you go up the hierarchical ladder. And of course, independent internet stars out of this conversation because they have usually have no physical contact with customers, right? So when we're talking about condom usage, you're talking about cat boy, call boy, bar worker, and street worker. Okay. So, with the condom usage, often condoms are seen as this hazmat suit, psychological hazmat suit, or even this physical hazmat suit, and barrier between work sex and real sex. Now, work sex is the sex that you're having with customers for money or material goods. Whereas real sex, that's the sex that you're having with a loved one, a boyfriend, a partner, a lover, right? Where you're not exchanging sexual services for money, right? So real sex, condomless sex with lovers. Whereas work sex is condom sex with customers. Okay. Let's go to the next set. Gay identification, we spoke about that ad nauseum, okay? Where gay identification tends to increase as one goes up the hierarchical ladder. Also, seeing sex work as a legitimate job, that will increase as one goes up because if you are engaging solely in sex work at the street level, more than likely is out of necessity and so that you can survive. So you don't see it as a legitimate job. You see it as something delinquent and risque, but you need to do it in order to make money. And so as you go up as a bar and then the escort and the cat boy, you see this sex work as a legitimate job, especially with the independent internet star, if that's your sole source of income, and you're making a lucrative living off of it. And as you go up this hierarchical ladder, more than often you will see this sex work as long-term work. Because if you are a cat boy, you're 18 and someone is taking care of you, more often than not, you're going to milk that until you can't anymore. And here's the thing of what happens with cat boys. Once they turn a particular age, usually late 20s or even mid 20s, especially into the 30s, That older gentleman may discard you and go for someone who's younger than you, possibly another college student or another 20-year-old or another 18-year-old. So, yes, that's how it goes. All right. So, what are some common misconceptions about sex work? Now we're getting into public policy here. Often people associate sex workers as vectors of sexually transmitted infections, HIV/AIDS, and societal corruption. However, sex workers, especially as you go up the hierarchical ladder, they tend to be really, really particular with their hygiene and also the measures they go and enact to protect themselves. Considering that capitalism and institutional oppression fuels individual and group marginalization and subordination, there would not be a supply of sex workers without a demand for them. And this comes from the socialist feminist perspective. This is the type of feminism that examines and utilizes Marxist ideologies, particularly when it comes to capitalism and bourgeoisie classes and the proletariat classes. Okay. Now, if there was not a demand for sex work, there will not be a need to supply it. Just like if no one liked chocolate Snickers bars, would Snickers bars exist? Absolutely not. Why? Because there's literally 0% demand for it. So because people like chocolate Snickers bars, that's why we have production of chocolate Snickers bars. Same ideology with sex work. Because there is a supply, excuse me, because there is a demand for sex work, for sexual services, that means there's going to be a supply for it. Now, who are the customers of sex workers, of male sex workers? Because we already went over the typical demographics of male sex workers, which is predominantly white. But who are the customers of these male sex workers? Often married white men, and also the growing population of single and divorced men. And also the concept of globalization contributes to the demand of sex workers. Remember, globalization is the worldwide exchange of goods, ideas, people, and money. So if there's an increase in traveling, and if people are traveling, more often than not, some of those people are traveling in order to engage in sex work in places where sex work is legal, okay? In order to take advantage of people who, not people necessarily. Well, you know, you can argue that. In order to take advantage of the opportunity to engage in sex work, okay, by merely paying for it. Okay, so there's demand for sex workers, both male and female workers, okay? There's also a demand for unprotected sex, lest a violent response or cancellation from male customers, okay? Also, customers tend to demand drug-infused sex, which contributes to violence, unprotected sex, drug use on the part of both customers and workers, and also rape. Okay, so we got the customers down pat, often married white men, and also single and divorced men, and also those single and divorced men who travel around the world. Okay, these are the demands of these customers. Okay, usually prefer both male and female. These customers also demand unprotected sex, and they also demand drug-infused sex. And if you're having drug-infused sex, more often than not, you will not use a condom, or a condom will not be used. Now, here's a video that I definitely want you to check out, okay? And are there different types of workers, sex workers? What are the potential benefits, risks of engaging in sex work as either a contractor or customer? And I also want you to articulate the ways in which sexual violence impact male sex workers. Now, trigger warning, this does talk about sexual violence, okay? And you do have to be of age considering that this is a college class. most of you are of age, okay? And I say most because we may have some child prodigies in the class. Okay, there's another video where we talked about gay for pay. I want you to articulate this concept. And also, how would you analyze this phenomenon from a feminist perspective of your choice, considering that there are different types of feminisms? Now, we have three different feminist applications to male sex work. We have liberalist feminism, we have radical feminism, and we have postmodern radical sexual pluralist feminism. Now, liberalist feminists see sex work as the selling, purchasing of sexual services, not bodies. They also see sex work as sexually empowering and also as a legitimate source of income. Now, the radical feminists, they say that sex work needs to be abolished. They also see sex work as a capitalization of marginalized male bodies as marketplace commodities. So, postmodern radical sexual pluralist feminists, they see that sex work is neither oppressive nor a source of sexual empowerment. And the radical sexual pluralist says sex work is an extension of sexual activity coded as deviant by society. So let's go through these. The liberalist feminists, pretty much self-explanatory, what we've been talking about before. Sex work as potentially sexually empowering and as a legitimate source of income, and the selling of sexual services, not bodies. However, radical feminists, they are more conservative when it comes to sex work. They say, you know what? Sex work is nothing more than taking advantage of people who may have little to no resources and or sources of income. So sex work needs to be abolished completely. Now, the postmodernists, they're like, you know what? We're neutral on the matter. It's not oppressive nor sexually empowering. It's just a source of income. Whereas the radical sexual pluralists, they're seeing sex work as, you know what, it's no different than masturbating in public. It's no different than, let's see here, incest. It's no different than any other sexual taboo, but it is considered taboo. So there are different ways and frameworks in which to conceptualize sex work depending upon which feminist lens you have. Do any of these match with your own lens? Let us know. Now, even though they have different viewpoints and lenses on sex work, they all argue for decriminalization of sex workers. And they also want to reframe participants as having immorality issues. According to all three of these doctrines, morality has nothing to do with it. It's not them who are immoral. It's the conditions in which put these folks into the position to sell sex work that's immoral. And also the customers who may have these demands of sex workers, such as having drug-infused sex and also having unprotected sex, that's immoral. And all three argue that male sex workers should have a greater quality of life and an improved quality of life. Sex work should be humane and not taboo, not criminalized, and also not stigmatized or marginalized. So even though we have different disagreements on how these particular doctrines view sex work, they all argue for the same resolutions. Doesn't that remind you of the main premise of having multiple different types of feminisms? Different strategies, but same goal, such as decriminalization, reframing participants as having immorality issues, and improving male sex workers' quality of life. So here are some critical discussion questions. What are the pros and cons of sex work legalization? So let's go over the pros. The pros are you can decriminalize sex work. There will be quality health and social legal services for sex workers. We can also promote education about sex work and its implications. And we can also invent social work programs for sex workers once legalized. So let's go through each of these components. With the criminalizing sex work, we will have sex work as legitimate business. There will also be rights to human, civil, and work protections for sex workers. And sex workers will be classified as a protected group, as well with ethnicity, religion, color, creed, gender, etc. And with decriminalizing sex work, we would expunge sex work related criminal records. What do you think about this as a pro? Another pro is quality health and social legal services. So, if we have quality health and social legal services, then we'll have a removal of criminal penalties and offenses pertinent to sex work. We'd also have improved law enforcement training when it comes to the representatives of authority navigating issues pertinent to sex workers and what they may go through on the job. Okay? So instead of having law enforcement exacerbate issues that's relevant to sex work, we will have law enforcement that knows how to navigate and provide solutions for issues pertinent to sex work. And with quality health and social legal services, we can also have public aid for active sex workers just in case they need ready access to lawyers, attorneys, etc., etc., etc. Now, another pro is promoting education about sex work and its implications. So, we will have increased hiring and training for positions in public policy, health administration, and also sex educators in various realms, such as community centers, colleges, universities, and also LGBTQ centers and mental health clinics and health clinics in general. We can also have social work programs as another pro, where you'll be able to combat homelessness and drug use via correctional facilities, HIV/AIDS clinics and research centers, public health departments, crisis centers, hospitals, and colleges, universities, where you can also then go back up to the third point in promoting education about sex work and its implications. This is what could happen. These are the types of customers you will likely come into contact with. If you have these requests that endanger your life or livelihood, contact these numbers for these social legal services to the second point, etc. And that you will not get in trouble to the first point with the decriminalization of sex work. So these are all the pros that feed into one another in your intersection. What do you think about these pros? Now let's go over the cons, because we must always look at both sides of an argument in order to make the best assessment. All three feminist doctrines champion for decriminalization without regulation. Why? Because regulation will require the government to require sex workers to be registered in some sort of system that takes away the anonymity of sex work. Also will require sex workers to get regularly tested, where their health records and everything. I mean, we do have HIPAA laws, but that does not necessarily guarantee protection from people, right? Because, yes, let's keep it simple. So regulation, that could have potential consequences of being invasive, such as, oh, sex workers can only engage in their work at these establishments, these specific establishments, and there should also be cameras in these rooms to prevent or at least capture any iterants of sexual violence or unconsensual sexual behavior. But then now we'll go into where would these recordings be stored and who will have access to them, and what are the measures in place to prevent people from sharing these videos or accessing them without authorization, etc. Right? So Liberalists and radical sexual pluralists, they argue that regulation will place prohibit, would prohibit sex workers, okay, with isolating, abusing, and exploiting them, also having further male-dominated control of male sex workers' bodies, and give unconstitutional government access to sexual encounters. And we mentioned all the specifics before when it came to regulation. Now, that is the end of our session for today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And I really do hope that this lecture showed you how we can put these different feminist theories into practice via the topic of male sex work. So I'm very excited to know what you learned and what you think about all of these things. Thank you.